Women's suffrage movement. The women's suffrage movement represented one of history's longest and most consequential civil rights struggles. For over 70 years, courageous women and male allies fought for women's right to vote, enduring ridicule, imprisonment, force-feeding, and violence. Their struggle challenged fundamental assumptions about gender, democracy, and human rights. The movement achieved political transformation, granting half the population democratic participation. This is the story of ordinary women who became revolutionaries, militants who embraced prison, and persistent activists who refused accepting inequality. Their victory fundamentally reshaped modern democracy. Women throughout history possessed virtually no political rights. Ancient civilizations excluded women from governance. Greek democracy, celebrated as birthplace of democracy, restricted voting to male citizens. Roman law granted women no political voice. Medieval European societies considered women inferior, requiring male guardianship. Enlightenment philosophers like Rousseau argued women's nature unsuited them for political participation. Women couldn't vote, hold office, or participate in political life. Women were legal property of fathers and husbands. Women couldn't own property, sign contracts, or control earnings in most jurisdictions. Society considered women intellectually and emotionally inferior. Politics was exclusively male domain. American and French revolutions proclaimed universal rights while excluding women. Declaration of Independence declared all men are created equal, literally men. French Revolution's Declaration of the Rights of Man excluded women despite female participation in revolution. Olympe de Gouges wrote Declaration of the Rights of Woman in 1791, asserting women's equality. Revolutionary government executed her. Revolutionary rhetoric about liberty and equality applied exclusively to men. This hypocrisy was not lost on women denied rights that revolutions supposedly championed. Mary Wollstonecraft published A Vindication of the Rights of Woman in 1792, challenging women's exclusion from Enlightenment principles. Wollstonecraft argued women appeared inferior only because denied education and opportunities. Wollstonecraft demanded women's access to education and political participation. Her radical ideas scandalized contemporary society. Critics attacked Wollstonecraft's morality and femininity. However, Wollstonecraft's work inspired future generations, establishing intellectual foundation for women's rights movement. American women's rights activism emerged from abolitionist movement. Women including Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony fought slavery's abolition. Working alongside male abolitionists, women gained organizational experience and political consciousness. However, male abolitionists often dismissed women's participation as inappropriate. Women were excluded from leadership despite crucial contributions. This exclusion radicalized female abolitionists, recognizing their own oppression paralleled slavery. If slavery violated human rights, so did women's subjugation. Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 launched organized American women's rights movement. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott organized convention in Seneca Falls, New York. Approximately 300 people attended, including 40 men. Stanton presented Declaration of Sentiments modeled on Declaration of Independence. Declaration asserted, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal." Declaration listed women's grievances including political exclusion, legal subordination, and economic discrimination. Declaration's most controversial demand was women's suffrage. Even many women's rights supporters considered voting rights too radical. Frederick Douglass, escaped slave and abolitionist leader, eloquently supported women's suffrage. Convention participants debated intensely before narrowly approving suffrage demand. Seneca Falls Convention established women's suffrage as central goal, though achieving it required 72 more years. Susan B. Anthony became suffrage movement's most tireless advocate. Anthony never married, dedicating life entirely to women's rights. Anthony traveled, constantly organizing, lecturing, and lobbying. Anthony possessed extraordinary organizational skills and strategic thinking. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton formed legendary partnership. Stanton provided intellectual firepower, while Anthony provided organizing genius. Anthony faced constant ridicule, threats, and hostility. Newspapers mocked her appearance and spinster status. Anthony persevered with remarkable courage and determination. The Civil War temporarily diverted attention from women's suffrage. Abolitionists, including female activists, prioritized ending slavery. Women supported war effort, anticipating gratitude would translate into political rights. Women served as nurses, managed farms and businesses, and supported families. Women demonstrated capabilities traditionally considered exclusively male. Women expected post-war recognition with voting rights. The 15th Amendment betrayed women's expectations catastrophically. Ratified in 1870, the amendment prohibited denying voting rights based on race, but excluded gender. Female abolitionists felt betrayed by male colleagues who abandoned women's suffrage. Frederick Douglass argued that former slaves needed voting rights more urgently than women. Douglass claimed it was the Negro's hour. Many female activists disagreed, believing women deserved simultaneous enfranchisement. The amendment split women's rights movement between those supporting amendment despite gender exclusion and those opposing it. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony opposed the amendment, arguing women deserved equal consideration. Lucy Stone and her husband Henry Blackwell supported amendment, believing women's turn would come later. This split created rival suffrage organizations lasting decades. Susan B. Anthony voted illegally in 1872 presidential election. Anthony believed the 14th Amendment, guaranteeing equal protection, implicitly granted women voting rights. Anthony convinced poll workers to allow her voting in Rochester, New York. Federal marshals arrested Anthony 2 weeks later. Anthony's trial became political theater. Judge directed jury to find Anthony guilty without deliberation. Blatant judicial misconduct. Anthony was fined $100, which she refused paying. Anthony used trial for publicity brilliantly. The case demonstrated legal system's hostility to women's rights while publicizing suffrage cause nationally. Victoria Woodhull addressed Congress in 1871, becoming first woman testifying before congressional committee. Woodhull argued women already possessed constitutional voting rights under 14th Amendment. Woodhull was controversial figure, stockbroker, newspaper publisher, an advocate of free love. Her unconventional lifestyle scandalized Victorian society. However, Woodhull's congressional testimony brought suffrage to national attention. Woodhull demonstrated women could engage political system directly despite exclusion. Western territories granted women suffrage before Eastern states. Wyoming Territory granted women full voting rights in 1869, first American jurisdiction doing so. Wyoming maintained women's suffrage upon statehood in 1890. Utah Territory granted women's suffrage in 1870, though Congress revoked it in 1887 through anti-polygamy legislation. Colorado granted women's suffrage in 1893. Idaho followed in 1896. Western states were less bound by traditional gender hierarchies. Frontier necessity required women's labor, making gender restrictions less tenable. Western suffrage victories provided evidence women's voting caused no catastrophic consequences opponents predicted. British suffrage movement developed parallel to American campaign. British women faced identical political exclusion. Middle-class women organized suffrage societies in 1860s 1870s. Millicent Garrett Fawcett led National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, NUWSS, pursuing constitutional methods, petitions, lobbies, and peaceful demonstrations. Fawcett believed patient persistence would eventually convince Parliament. However, decades passed without progress. Parliament repeatedly rejected women's suffrage bills. Peaceful methods seemed ineffective against intransigent opposition. Emmeline Pankhurst founded Women's Social and Political Union, WSPU, in 1903, embracing militant tactics. Pankhurst lost patience with constitutional methods producing no results. WSPU adopted motto "Deeds not words," pursuing direct action. WSPU members called themselves suffragettes, distinguishing themselves from non-militant suffragists. Suffragettes heckled politicians, chained themselves to railings, broke windows, and committed arson. Pankhurst declared, "The argument of the broken window pane is the most valuable argument in modern politics." Suffragette militancy escalated dramatically. Suffragettes bombed empty buildings, slashed paintings in museums, and set fire to mailboxes. Emily Davison threw herself before King's Horse at Epsom, Derby in 1913, dying from injuries. Whether Davison intended suicide or protest remains debated, but her death became suffragette martyrdom. Militancy divided public opinion. Some admired suffragettes' courage. Others condemned violence as unfeminine and counterproductive. Pankhurst argued militancy was necessary because peaceful methods failed. Men had won democratic rights through violence. Women deserved same tactics. Imprisoned suffragettes endured brutal treatment. Authorities imprisoned hundreds of suffragettes for property destruction and public disorder. Imprisoned suffragettes declared themselves political prisoners, demanding special status. Government refused. Suffragettes began hunger strikes protesting prison conditions. Authorities responded with forced feeding, brutal procedure involving tubes forced through nose or mouth. Force feeding was agonizing and dangerous. Suffragettes described torture. Public opinion turned against government as force-feeding details emerged. Government passed Cat and Mouse Act in 1913, releasing hunger strikers until health recovered, then rearresting them. This cynical policy avoided force-feeding while ensuring suffragettes served sentences. Alice Paul brought militant tactics to America after experiencing British suffragette movement. Paul organized 1913 woman suffrage procession in Washington, D.C. the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. 8,000 women marched while 500,000 spectators watched. Male spectators attacked marchers. Police stood by permitting violence. Over 100 women were hospitalized. The violence generated enormous sympathy and publicity. Paul founded National Woman's Party, NWP, in 1916, pursuing aggressive tactics. NWP picketed White House daily, first group ever doing so. Picketers carried banners criticizing Wilson for opposing women's suffrage while claiming to fight for democracy in World War I. The irony was pointed. World War I complicated suffrage campaigns. British and American governments demanded women's support for war efforts. Suffrage organizations split between supporting war and maintaining suffrage focus. Pankhurst suspended WSPU militant activities, supporting British war effort. Pankhurst believed demonstrating patriotism would earn voting rights. Other suffragists, including Fawcett's NUWSS, continued suffrage advocacy while supporting war. American suffragists similarly divided. Some, including Carrie Chapman Catt, supported war. Others, including Alice Paul, maintained focus exclusively on suffrage, criticizing government hypocrisy. Women's wartime contributions proved crucial to suffrage victory. Women replaced men in factories, transportation, and agriculture. Women demonstrated capability in roles previously considered exclusively male. Women's essential wartime work made denying voting rights increasingly untenable. British Prime Minister David Lloyd George acknowledged women's contributions, arguing voting rights were deserved reward. American President Woodrow Wilson similarly recognized women's contributions, eventually supporting suffrage despite previous opposition. British women gained limited suffrage in 1918. Representation of the People Act granted voting rights to women over 30 who met property qualifications. This compromise enfranchised approximately 8.5 million women, still excluding younger women and poor women. Full equal suffrage came in 1928 when voting age lowered to 21, matching men's voting age. British suffrage victory after decades of struggle vindicated both militant and constitutional tactics. Historians debate which tactics proved most effective. Both likely contributed. Militancy generated attention, while constitutional methods provided respectable alternative. American women achieved suffrage through 19th Amendment ratified August 18, 1920. The amendment declared, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." Amendment's passage required decades of state-by-state campaigns, federal lobbying, and wartime contributions. Carrie Chapman Catt's strategic winning plan coordinated state and federal efforts. Alice Paul's militant National Woman's Party maintained pressure through picketing and protests. President Wilson eventually endorsed suffrage in 1918, calling it vitally essential to the successful prosecution of the Great War. Senate passed amendment June 4, 1919. Ratification required 36 states. Tennessee became decisive 36th state on August 18, 1920, by single vote. Harry Byrne, Tennessee legislator, changed vote supporting suffrage after receiving letter from mother urging support. Byrne's vote achieved suffrage after 72-year struggle. Suffrage victory had limitations requiring ongoing struggle. Southern states systematically disenfranchised black women through literacy tests, poll taxes, and violence despite 19th Amendment. Native American women couldn't vote until 1924 when citizenship was granted. Asian American women faced exclusion until immigration restrictions lifted mid-20th century. The 19th Amendment granted legal right, but actual access required defeating systematic discrimination. Black women's voting rights weren't secure until 1965. Voting Rights Act prohibited racial discrimination. Suffrage movement was predominantly white middle class, failing to address intersectional discrimination. Black suffragists like Ida B. Wells fought simultaneously for women's and racial justice, facing exclusion from white suffrage organizations. International suffrage movement achieved victories globally. New Zealand granted women's suffrage in 1893, becoming first self-governing nation doing so. Australia followed in 1902. Finland granted women full political rights in 1906, including right to stand for office. Norway granted suffrage in 1913. Women's suffrage spread across Europe and Americas through early 20th century. Each victory inspired movements elsewhere. By 1950, most Western democracies granted women voting rights. However, some nations, including Switzerland, didn't grant full women's suffrage until 1971. Saudi Arabia granted limited women's voting rights in 2015. Global suffrage movement continues in nations denying women full political participation. Suffrage victory transformed women's political participation fundamentally. Women voted in elections influencing policy. Women ran for office, winning legislative seats and executive positions. Jeannette Rankin became first woman elected to Congress in 1916, even before 19th Amendment. Women organized politically, addressing issues including education, health care, and social welfare. Women's organizations became political forces. However, women didn't vote as unified bloc, contrary to some predictions. Women held diverse political views spanning ideological spectrum. Women's suffrage didn't revolutionize politics overnight, but fundamentally changed democratic participation. Suffrage movement legacy extends beyond voting rights. The movement established women's political agency and activism traditions. Suffragist organizing tactics influenced subsequent civil rights movements. Suffrage victory demonstrated that determined organizing could overcome entrenched opposition. The movement produced legendary leaders whose courage inspires contemporary activists. Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Emmeline Pankhurst, Alice Paul, and countless others demonstrated extraordinary determination. They endured ridicule, imprisonment, and violence pursuing justice. Their persistence achieved fundamental democratic transformation. The suffrage movement teaches crucial lessons. Rights denied must be fought for persistently. Oppression doesn't end voluntarily. Those with power resist sharing it. Social change requires sustained organizing across generations. The suffrage movement spanned 72 years in America and similar durations elsewhere. Multiple generations dedicated lives to achieving goal many didn't live to see realized. This generational commitment demonstrates that justice requires long-term persistence beyond individual lifetimes. Different tactics serve crucial roles in social movements. Suffrage movement encompassed both moderate constitutional methods and militant direct action. Moderates like Millicent Fawcett and Carrie Chapman Catt pursued patient lobbying and education. Militants like Emmeline Pankhurst and Alice Paul embraced disruptive tactics and civil disobedience. Both approaches contributed to victory. Moderates provided respectable alternative, while militants generated urgency and attention. This tactical diversity proved strategically effective, creating multiple pressure points. Coalition building proved essential yet challenging. Suffragists built alliances across class, region, and ideology. However, suffrage movement struggled with racial inclusion. White suffragists often excluded black women, fearing Southern opposition. This exclusion represented moral failure, limiting movement's justice claims. Contemporary movements must learn from this failure, building truly inclusive coalitions addressing intersecting oppressions. The personal is political. Suffragists' individual experiences motivated political activism. Women experiencing legal subordination, economic exploitation, and social marginalization understood oppression personally. This personal understanding fueled political commitment. Suffragists connected individual experiences to systemic inequality, recognizing that personal struggles reflected broader injustice requiring political solutions. Women's suffrage victory was beginning, not conclusion, of women's equality struggle. Voting rights were necessary but insufficient for full equality. Women continued fighting for equal employment opportunities, reproductive rights, equal pay, protection from violence, and cultural equality. Second-wave feminism in 1960s 1970s addressed issues beyond suffrage. Contemporary feminism addresses ongoing inequalities, including wage gaps, representation in leadership, and gender-based violence. Suffrage laid foundation, but equality remains an incomplete project. Global women's equality remains unfinished. Women in many nations lack full political rights. Even in democracies, women face barriers to political participation, including discrimination, violence, and economic constraints. Women remain underrepresented in political leadership globally. Achieving women's full equality requires continued activism building on suffragists' foundation. The women's suffrage movement represents triumph of human determination over entrenched injustice. Ordinary women became extraordinary activists. They organized, marched, protested, went to prison, hunger struck, and refused accepting inequality. They persisted through decades of defeats, building movement that eventually could not be denied. They transformed democracy, making it truly representative. They proved that determined people can change seemingly immovable systems. Their courage and persistence achieved political revolution. We inherit their victory and responsibility to continue their unfinished work. The suffragists remind us that justice doesn't arrive inevitably, but through persistent struggle by courageous people refusing to accept oppression. Their legacy challenges us to fight contemporary injustices with equal determination, knowing that persistence eventually achieves seemingly impossible transformations.